record, and I'm going to get the first session slides, and I'm going to hand over to Claire.
Thank you, Imogen, that's great. And welcome from myself as well to this session, which I was saying to Martin following the panel about assessment. From personal experience, I think this session's topics and the assessment topics are the two thorniest that I have seen throughout these recent months. So I'm really privileged to be able to chair this one. I'm so glad to see you all here. So if you want to give them a little wave and hello and a round of applause to kick us off. I'm hopefully going to be only doing the timekeeping and everything's going to run to plan. So I'm going to hand over first to Martin and Alison, who are going to give us some top tips about online relationships. And you have got until 3:55. Which would include your time for questions. And then after that, we're going to pass over to Alexandra and Orna, who are then going to share their experience about navigating the beliefs that academics have around the pedagogies of transitioning to online. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Martin.
I'm going to step in. This is Alison, and I'm working with Martin. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this session as well. I think we'll have some good discussion. So how do we best support our academic colleagues to become educators in a blended learning context or a digital context? And since about the 16th of March, this has been a daily question for Martin and I, along with our colleagues in Greenwich Learning and Teaching, which is a centralised learning and teaching quality enhancement and quality assurance unit at the University of Greenwich. I should start with a disclaimer. We are not learning technologists. I think Martin and I start every staff development workshop with that kind of stated claim, but we're approaching this topic from an academic development perspective, as this is a sort of core element of our roles at the University of Greenwich, where we're lecturers in HE learning and teaching. We've heard over the course of the past 2 days, colleagues sharing some really impressive practice around what they've been doing, supporting academics over the last 9 months, supporting them to transition into these blended and digital contexts, which has been great, really stimulating to hear. But I think when Martin and I were thinking about today's session and preparing for this, we've had some really critical discussions that have forced us to confront and really challenge the narratives within our team, with colleagues and within our institution around what we've been trying to do, maybe what we've also achieved within the last 9 months. And that's not to take away from the sort of Herculean efforts of our colleagues, but what we feel is there's this tension between the sort of top tips approach to development and a move towards something that might be more fundamental or more of a transformation. So that's really shaping our focus today. So what have we been doing? Really sort of headline, from very early on in the spring, Martin and I have been working together with our colleagues, and we've developed, you might want to call it a brand called ABLE, which was an acronym for Adjusting to Blended Learning Environment. And we used that to frame our staff development activities. Martin coordinated all the CPD workshops that were linked to ABLE, and there was also a linked Moodle self-paced staff CPD site. So there was an ABLE Moodle site which I coordinated. So that's a bit of a headline kind of context for today. Hopefully everyone's moved with me onto the next slide with the high-fiving players. But basically, in running our staff development workshops and exploring, having discussions with staff around how they've engaged with ABLE, we've had some really positive feedback. We've had some staff who are like, yes, this is fantastic. They've really enjoyed this opportunity to think differently about their teaching practice. Some have even said this has rekindled my love of teaching. They've really been pushed and motivated. So you're getting a sense of that kind of real change in practice, that transformational type narrative, a building of confidence and building of skills and capabilities. But we also had some feedback that actually was more of this, oh, okay. And it sort of, some of this feedback, I want to replicate what I do face-to-face, but in the digital environment. Or if I do an hour-long lecture face-to-face, Well, in the online context, that just means doing an hour-long live session, but in Teams or in Zoom or in Blackboard. So what we kind of see in this type of feedback is that staff are looking to recreate what they do face-to-face online, like in a sort of digital space. So there is this persistence of quite conservative, maybe practice, potentially even some quite dated conceptions of teaching, and staff are looking to pull these into a digital space. So again, challenging this notion of transformation. So I'll hand over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Alison. So what we've tried to conceptualize here is this idea of the BC, the before COVID, and this image, I suppose, captures a perspective that is something that can be representative of what it's like looking from the center of the university outwards. But as Alison has already said, not from a sort of learning technology perspective. We don't actually have any centralized learning technologists, instructional designers. We only have the academic development unit and IT services. So make of that what you will for the moment. But it's this idea that in the conservative practices that we were talking a lot about in the assessment panel discussion earlier, is this idea that you can see this sort of vista from your troglodyte cave, your dinosaur behaviors, that there is this brave new world, there is this shiny utopia that's possible. And very often in other institutions, it's the learning technologists and those who are at the forefront of innovation who are signaling this and flagging this up and saying, look what you can do, look what's possible. But in many ways, from our point of view, it's a kind of a dream, an unreachable dream. I'm not criticizing my institution overtly here, but what I'm saying is that it's been very hard to reach anything like a kind of utopian vision for a very long time before COVID. But of course, as COVID evolved, so we find that attitudes necessarily changed. Being the mother of invention as it is. Just to say a little bit more before I talk about what happened after we all went into this lockdown emergency remote teaching mode, and it's to say a little bit about the way that we were perceiving things, that before COVID position. So Alison and I are both hugely experienced in teaching online. I'm not sure this person is in this first image in the top left-hand corner here, what with the dodgy angle and the writing on a piece of paper. Terrible practice, if you ask me. But this is what we do routinely. We're one of only 2 programs actually at Greenwich that runs a fully online program. And we've been doing that for quite some time. Alison also works at the Open University. So, you know, we know what we're talking about. But interestingly, ours was one of the only programs suspended for the duration of this academic year because our services, I suppose, our support was needed elsewhere to plug a gap, to fill a vacuum, if you will. And therefore, the apologies for the central image are there. Our role has always been one to scaffold support, to see the opportunities for development, to reach for the skies or whatever else you want to make of the other images we've chosen there. And we tried to do that, but within this very interesting, I know it's not unique, but quite unusual context where the learning technology side of things was seen to be something that you subsume within all other kinds of academic development work. So we went from pre-COVID to AD, which is of course all digital, or if you prefer, you can think of it as a mid-disaster. And suddenly the vacuum seems a lot bigger, and there's this massive elephant in the room, which is the digital preparedness of the institution, the digital capabilities, not only of our students, which a lot of people assumed. Of course, that whole nonsense, the whole myth of the digital native was really thrown into the foreground of people's thinking in COVID, as we see students across the board unable to access the internet, not having the kind of technology and the tools that we might assume that they had. But also, this is something that is experienced by staff as well. So how did we confront that? How did we get on top of that? Back to Alison.
Yeah, so it was very much in this context. So when Martin and I were facilitating workshops around teaching in teams and you know, using different types of technologies, creating videos, all this kind of stuff. And it, again, we were thinking about what kind of desires and tensions were kind of emerging in terms of what we were trying to achieve and the types of discussions we were having with staff. Now, as academic developers, our focus is very much on trying to empower our staff. We really want to try and push them to think differently about their practice. So that point about foregrounding pedagogy, it's absolutely key for Martin and I, and that was why we kept doing this. We are not learning technologists and trying to maybe in some ways create that space for some of the more sort of pedagogical discussion and what we call leading with the need. We want our colleagues to have the confidence, but to feel empowered in translating the pedagogical principles that they tend to have in that face-to-face context and what that might look like in a different environment, in a different context. And that they have the confidence and, as I say, the sort of capabilities to do that. Also that they're thinking about really focusing on the learning that they want their students to achieve and how they can best get there. And that will support them in terms of making decisions about what tools they want to use. And that leads us into that point of the why over the how. So many challenges because we were seeing this kind of fixation on tools and things like that. But I don't know, fundamentally were people really taking a step back? So something, and thinking about not just the tools, but the design of their teaching, the design of their learning. So if they want to support an active classroom, active student engagement in an online synchronous session, really what are they doing in terms of not just the technology, but the design and the pedagogy to actually enable that active learning? You know, active learning in an online session is not just, can I get my students to turn on their microphone or turn on their camera. Another thing that really informed Martin and I's practice, and on reflection maybe sort of a bit too implicitly, but did shape our thinking, was around compassion as a really core theme. And we were conscious of the work of Paul and Theo Gilbert on compassion-focused pedagogy, on Catherine Denial about pedagogies of kindness. And we really wanted staff to be conscious of these issues of compassion around themes of digital access, also about the sort of digital skills and digital literacies, that argument of the digital natives, but also about this fundamental lack of choice imposed by COVID. Our colleagues didn't expect to teach in that way. Our students didn't necessarily want to learn in that way. So I think just being really, really conscious of compassion was core for Martin and I in terms of how we build those relationships with our students in that digital space and build these digital learning communities, and that should really be a focus for our efforts. But we also then had, and Martin's put some links in the chat to give some examples if people want to look at them, we also had this tension because of course we need to support staff in terms of their digital skills and feeling confident in this digital space, but we had a lot of pressure on us from colleagues who were like, you need to teach top tips. What are the absolute fundamentals that staff need to know if they're teaching in teams? And we, you know, requests for staff need to know what buttons to press. That should be the focus of your energies. We also had loads of questions in our sessions. We were trying to explore with staff the nature of their teaching around, tell me how to share my screen, tell me how to share my slides, how do I mute buttons, you know, all sorts of tech type questions. But all of these were revealing, again, this continued call of conservatism and this focus on the technology, I think because of this really forced context that we were in. Martin, I'll pass back to you.
Okay, thank you.
I forgot about this slide.
That was you, wasn't it? Yeah, you forgot your slide. You want to say anything about this one?
Really, this is just a slide that Martin and I use in some of our discussions that signpost the number of different tools and platforms that we use. And what we found was that people have focused on each tool individually, or F2F is face-to-face, it isn't a tool, but it's a teaching space or a platform, that a place to engage with students. So staff were focusing on each of these in turn, like how do I learn how to use each of these, rather than really taking a step back and thinking, what is this blended learning context that I'm trying to create for my students, for my learners? So again, this fixation kind of on tools. I'll hand it back to you, Martin.
Cheers. Okay, so I mean, one of the things that Alice and I have talked a lot about, because we've run a lot of sessions together, so we've had those opportunities in those post-session reflective moments to try and conceptualize what it is that we're hearing. And, you know, in the chat, there's a discussion going on about, you know, video length, lectures as videos, also the idea of the top tips. Claire's saying that that's, you know, the most used phrase in emails. And we've tried to sort of think about it from a conceptual point of view, from a theoretical point of view. And often the things that we see are things like Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation curve, which I think is sometimes misunderstood or misused, particularly by people who want to show that everything's working, we're moving towards it, and it doesn't matter if there are laggards because eventually everyone gets there in the end. But of course, this is representative of only successful innovations. What about the things that haven't been successful and have been tried? Or still, most of the institution is laggardly, and you've only got half a dozen innovators at the front end who are getting on with these things. So we found that very uncomfortable, and as Alison suggested, tool focused, which is one of the problems that we've encountered, is that people are obsessed by what Panopto can do, or what Teams can do, or what any other of the tools that we're using at a big institutional level can do, and forgetting about the teaching and learning. And as one of our colleagues has said in the chat, you know, a good learning technologist will focus on pedagogy first, rather than that emphasis on technology. And so we found it really problematic to try and theorize this from a tool perspective. So what did we do? We turned to the way that the institution was framing it, and that central image there that you can see on the screen, this graph, this, you know, one colleague helping another, is probably the best way I can represent the institutional narrative that's going on at my place at the moment. Yeah, we're all helping each other, everything's getting better, satisfaction's going up, and of course, you know, you can't generalize about an institution. You can't generalize even about a faculty or a department. So actually, I'm prepared to put my neck on the line here, put my head above the parapet, and say that that narrative is a lot of nonsense. And it's not helpful at all, because it masks so much of the reality. So what did we do? We turned to ways of representing trials and errors of progress, and we came up with the Kubler-Ross bereavement curve, which has been morphed into the Fisher transition curve. And, you know, individuals might be able to plot themselves on that, but even that didn't work. Then we thought, you know what we need? We need a 1980s heavily pixelated video game to represent what it is that we're thinking. And it's the map from this game called Outrun, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's had many iterations, that really did nail it for us. So if you look at this map here, you've got options at each of these junctions here. And it's these junctions that we think that we've been encountering colleagues at different stages as we've gone through the whole COVID experience. And it's here, the A, that we really want people to reach, the positive decisions at each junction, because the A represents those colleagues who have embraced and who've engaged, who've had that transformative experience. They've made positive choices at each stage. And it's here at the bottom where the people are desperate to get back on campus. They can't wait to do their face-to-face lectures, to get back to their safe zones, their comfort zones, and forget about the digital at all. And all the way down the line, there are different ways that people could have turned. It's not, I'm either digital or not. It's decisions at key points. So here, for example, it might be a decision to forget what people have been saying about bandwidth and access and accessibility and compassion, and say, all my lectures are going to be on Teams live at this time. If you can't make it, hard bloody luck. Or they can say, no, I'm going to embrace what my colleagues have been saying and record my lectures. Good. I know that I would have an argument with some of you here about this decision here, but one of the things that we've been heavily pushing is the shortening, the bite-sizing of threshold concepts, and not trying to give students what they think they want. Argue with me if you want, which is hour-long replacements for what they think they're missing in the hour-long lectures in the live lecture halls. So we found this is quite a useful way of replicating or representing what we're doing. And in fact, what we've tried to share with you today is the essence of our approach overall. The cogs we've represented here as coming together but not working as a machine. It's a metaphor, and it's really helped drive what we've been doing. And the reordering of our thinking as well, we've used this 5 C's idea as a heuristic for getting across mindset, necessary mindset changes in a hurry that are still necessary, rather than obsessing over individual tools, getting people to reprogram their own minds out of the constraining and quite conservative pedagogic mindsets that they were currently existing in. I see we only have a minute or so of our presentation time left if we're going to allow some time for questions, but Alison, you've got to do the big finale in a hurry, so there you go.
That's okay. I mean, I'm hoping in some ways, I'm seeing from the chat, there's lots of discussion here. I think this is really resonating with people. But Martin and I were like, okay, really, what have we learned from this? I'm going to foreground, again, the compassion, I think, is absolutely key. And I think that compassion between both colleagues and students. Vicky, you'd pointed to the fact that some staff, their engagement with this area is actually sometimes to the detriment of their own well-being. I think that's quite an interesting point. But also we're now speaking with staff who, because they felt so disempowered in terms of their relationships with the technology, they then have this feeling of, well, nothing I do is good enough because I'm not using every single tool the university is offering me. And actually it's that decision making, it's that empowering them and giving them that, or supporting them in that knowledge around how they make decisions. And if they only use a couple of different things, but it enables them to meet the needs of their students, that's good, and they shouldn't be beating themselves up. Other kind of things just to point to really quickly on the slide, actually Stuart, you made a point about failure and some of the more negative things, and I think Martin and I have been thinking a lot about that, like helping staff to recognise where their comfort zone is, and maybe sort of nudging, pushing beyond that, maybe presenting them or embracing the fact that, yeah, this is downright challenging. There are some difficulties around this. We have learned to become okay online educators through, I'm going to say decades, around there, like collectively decades of experience teaching online, and lots of failure along the way. And I think just kind of more open discussion of some of the difficulties around this. Also kind of further down on this slide, taking the tools off their shiny pedestals. Again, like more critical discussion around some of this kind of technology, I think is, you know, quite important, exploring critical digital pedagogy and this type of thing. We didn't feel we had enough space with our staff to take them on a journey to really engage with some of the research, with some of the literature. So people would ask us what they thought was a really straightforward question that they wanted a really direct answer for. And sometimes you were almost paralyzed because you were like, I'm drawing on experience, I'm drawing on tons of reading to sort of give you an answer. And you've then got the answer, but you don't necessarily understand everything that's kind of gone into that. So I think just a bit more space kind of with some of our colleagues to explore the challenges, to think more critically about technology, to foreground some of that research. And possibly, I think Martin and I would both agree, I think we maybe felt we could have challenged more of the assumptions that were floating around within our institution, within our team, with our senior management around blended learning, what we really mean by that, and kind of use of that sort of digital technology. We faced that, we put on the slide high flex. I think I'm still recovering from the comment where someone said that sort of hybrid flex model was the holy grail of blended learning. I'm still recovering from that kind of statement. So yeah, I think I'll maybe pause there in case people do have questions, but I'm hoping some of the themes on this slide do look familiar to those of you working in this space.
Okay, thanks so much. You've exactly finished on the 5 to 4 point. So I think what we'll do is there's lots, as you say, of great discussion in the chat. So I think we'll pass over to Alexander and Orna for their presentation, and then we can come back to questions, maybe to